'Tis a common observation here that our cause is the cause of all mankind, and that we are fighting for their liberty in defending our own. Benjamin Franklin.
So it was possible.
The Americans, against all odds, defeated the most powerful empire in the world.
And they didn't just win a war, they built something entirely new.
A government rooted in liberty and representation and the idea that power didn't belong to a king.
But to the people.
And if farmers, frontiersmen, and laborers could do that,
then what was stopping everyone else?
Across the Atlantic, people were watching,
waiting,
wondering if revolution could be theirs too. "250 years ago, our nation was born.
America's story is veiled in mystique and folklore, marked by tales of valor and bloodshed.
To understand America as we know it, we must understand where it began. I'm Bridget Miller.
I'm Macy Kendrick.
I'm Natalie Miller, and this is the Patriot Papers. While the war is commonly referred to as the American Revolution, the global scale of the American fight for independence was significant.
Not only did the actual fighting involve more than just the British and Americans, but the aftermath of the American victory inspired other revolutionary action across the world.
Yorktown marked the first time in history that a colony had separated from its mother country, and it is reasonable to say that a new understanding of imperial power was born.
The international aspect of the American Revolution set the stage for America to build diplomatic relationships and establish themselves in the political and economic world.
While many notable revolutionary figures such as Washington spent the years of the war in the colonies themselves, many key figures in America's founding actually spent much of their time abroad during the war as advocates for the American cause. So two really famous examples of this are Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Do you guys know what Benjamin Franklin was doing throughout the war?
He was in Great Britain, right?
He actually spent most of his time in France,
Oh.
but he was also in Great Britain. But he served as America's first foreign ambassador for France and was trying to negotiate arms deals and get funds from France for the American cause. And he was kind of able to leverage his celebrity status at the time to help convince the French government to join the war effort. And of course, this is along with the win at Saratoga, as we talked about last episode, as being a real turning point in the war. And then John Adams, who we know also spent much of the war in Europe, going between kind of France and the Netherlands, which I found really interesting. So he was kind of responsible for securing these trade deals between the Netherlands and America and bringing supplies and aid. At least personally, it kind of seemed like a really random country, but I guess...
Yeah, I feel like we don't really hear about the Netherlands in regards to what countries were involved in the revolution. So.
We hear a lot about France, and we'll talk about Spain a little bit more in a minute, but yeah, it was kind of interesting to see. So while the military side of this war is contained to the colonies itself, its decision-making and influence had a much broader reach.
Yeah, and beyond those that were advocating for American independence abroad, the Patriots also had their sights set on making key alliances early on in the war, like we've talked about with the French. So why would France even be interested in being involved with the American Revolution to begin with?
Well, historically, before we get to the point of the American Revolution, France and Great Britain are competing empires. They often butt heads on various things. I mean, we keep bringing up the 7 Years' War. That's one example. So anything that might weaken the British Empire is probably, they will see it as a benefit to them.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Bridget. So they have a notoriously tense history. And of course, yes, the French and Indian War, the French were defeated by the British, and at this time the American colonists as well. So the loss of that war sort of left France hungry for revenge, if you will, and the American Revolution was the perfect chance to enact that, or at least try to. And sure enough, by 1776, the French had begun sending weapons and ammunition to the Patriots, and then later on they would join the military side of the war as well. So why would the Americans want the French as allies?
Well, they obviously want the money, the help. We talked a lot last episode about how the Continental Army doesn't have a navy, and that's a big part that France adds. So I'm guessing really just supplies and manpower.
So yeah, the Americans do really want the French as allies for all of those reasons, but we hadn't exactly convinced France right off the bat if we were like a worthy opponent quite yet against the British Empire. But in true American fashion, we're always up to a challenge to prove ourselves, and that's exactly what we did at Saratoga, which is what we've talked about in a previous episode. This truly was the turning point that convinced France to join the war. As for the entire war itself, it's definitely up for debate if America would have won without French assistance, but the French had something the United States did not that would really change the tide of the war, a navy, which we've talked about in a previous episode. So it's sort of one of these fun questions of history to consider if the Americans would have won without French support, but there's no doubt that without the French fighting alongside, we would have had a much more difficult time winning the American Revolution, or it's possible that it would have taken a lot longer. So what do we budding historians think about this question of history?
I feel like, and of course, like, there's really no way to know, but I feel like it's safe to say it would have taken a lot longer. Like, a lot of the, like, aid from France is really pivotal. Like leaders like Marquis de Lafayette certainly leave an impact. And then also, what kind of victory could you have at Yorktown without holding them in with the French Navy? So yeah, I feel like it's fair to think that it would take longer, at least.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, as we've said, Yorktown, like, was won because supplies couldn't get into the British because of the French Navy, so I think it's almost certain that that wouldn't have been the end of the war had France not been there. But yeah, I wonder how much longer it would have taken. I mean, is there even a possibility that America wouldn't have won at all?
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think that something to remember is that Yorktown, it came at a very opportune time because the Patriot supplies and forces were dramatically weakened. They were running out of money, running out of supplies, and it's no secret that the French really helped us win that victory at Yorktown. Who knows if there would have been another opportunity.
Yeah, it's really interesting food for thought to sort of sit with those questions where it is really all you can do is speculate, but it's fun to sort of try and tackle those questions. So, another European empire with vested interest in this war was Spain. By the time of the American Revolution, Spain was at odds with Great Britain and close allies with France, but their relationship with the United States and before that the colonies was more complicated. So, like I said, they kind of are opponents with Great Britain. They compete with them militarily and territorially. Spain had lost Gibraltar to England in 1713, and they'd been trying to get it back from them ever since. They also got pulled into the 7 Years' War, which is less than 15 years before the Revolution. They were pulled into it in 1762, so right as it was wrapping up. As a French ally, they had to end up ceding Florida territory to Great Britain in the Treaty of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War. And Florida was important because it guarded their maritime routes to the more lucrative colonies in Central and South America. And so now, without Florida, these routes to those colonies are threatened. So definitely gives them sort of something to hold against the British. They are also allied with France and obviously not super friendly with the British, but they're not eager to join the fight. Why might that be?
Well, you just mentioned that they have colonies themselves. So I'm guessing supporting a revolution there is almost contradictory to, like, what you're doing, having colonies yourself as an imperial power.
It definitely pertains to them having colonies in the Americas. They don't want to sort of start this trend of colonies rising up, and they also don't really want to create an American empire that would start expanding. So it would threaten their colonies over there if there was now a new entity that central government was over there in the Americas. They're more decentralized with their own colonies. However, that being said, they definitely don't side with the British in this. So in the early years of the war, Spain is not formally involved, but they actually do help the Americans under the table. They send money, less than the French, but they're still helping. They open up Spanish Caribbean ports to U.S. trade, and they also let the U.S. Ships dock in these ports. And then, of course, we keep coming back to it, Saratoga. What does Saratoga do for the Spanish?
I really don't know that much about Spanish involvement in the American Revolution, but I do know that for the American forces fighting at Saratoga, this was really a point at which people saw them as a serious fighting force. So could that have been the same across the board with France and with Spain?
Yeah, it is. This is something, This is an event that proved to Spain as well as France that the Americans were serious and could stand their ground against the Redcoats. I will say they were not inspired in the same way as the French, because the French signed a treaty directly with the United States. Spain never directly signs any treaty with the U.S. through this war. It's more like we, Spain, are teaming up with the French, and they're going to team up with the United States, so I guess that we're on the same side. And so technically the series of events goes, Saratoga happens with U.S. victory, the United States and France sign a treaty, and then Great Britain declares war on France in response to that. So then Spain and France, in April of 1779, sign a treaty to reaffirm their alliance against the British, and then Spain declares war on Great Britain in June of 1779. So this changes a lot. Spain's declaration of war widens the American Revolution, and it now envelops their own interests.
Well, you just mentioned that Spain lost some territory to Great Britain during the 7 Years' War, so I imagine they probably want some of this territory back.
Yeah, exactly. One of their things that they state as their objectives are taking back territory like Gibraltar, Pensacola, Bay of Honduras, Minorca. These are all items that are lost to the British. And so while they're helping Americans fight for their independence, they're fighting the British for their own personal interests, which are expanding it to the global perspective. So what benefits is Spain providing for the Patriot cause?
I'm guessing the same as France, basically like arms, money, maybe even men.
Yeah, so Spain adds a number advantage to this like joint force of the Patriots, the French, and now Spain. They provide troops, and they do provide ships in attacks against Pensacola and Mobile. So these are sort of places that are also sort of interesting or matter in some way to them. And so just to wrap it up, the best way to understand Spain's role is by realizing that the United States and Spain were united by a common enemy, Great Britain, and a mutual friend, France. But this cooperation was only situational, and they would compete later on. We'll talk about it.
So just as the Americans looked for allies internationally, so did the British. And they found these allies in the infamous Hessians. So the Hessians are a group of mercenary soldiers, meaning that they basically fight for whoever pays them. So this group is from modern-day Germany, or from a region known as Hesse, hence the name. The British hired almost 30,000 of these Hessian soldiers over the course of the war to fight in the colonies, which in my mind, that seems like a really staggering number.
Yeah, I guess I didn't realize it was that many of them that were hired to fight in this war.
And they hired another 10,000 that were stationed in places like British South Africa, the British Indies, and Gibraltar. So how do you think that the Hessians and the Patriots viewed each other?
Well, so you said that these are soldiers who get paid to fight.
Correct.
So, I mean, their occupation is pretty much fighting. These are professional soldiers. I imagine that there's a little bit of a skill gap between the Patriots and the Hessians. So, animosity of some sort, maybe some sort of, concern?
Yeah, I think that's correct. So the Continental Army worked pretty hard to avoid these mercenary soldiers when they first arrived, because they saw them as a superior fighting force. And on the flip side of that, the Hessians viewed the Americans as really inferior. One Hessian soldier even described the state of the Continental Army and their gear as, and I quote, "in a sorry state," end quote.
I mean, they're not wrong. This isn't a false judgment on them. It is certainly what the Continental Army is at this point. They're a bunch of farmers essentially with weapons.
They are a ragtag militia coming together.
Although I will ask, does their view of the Americans as inferior, does that, I feel like that could maybe at some point be attributed to underestimating them and, an unexpected, victory. We're not supposed to win the war, but, the Patriots did.
Yeah, and actually the view that the Hessians had of the Continental Army does change after the Battle of Trenton. It kind of changes for both sides. So at this battle, the Continental Army forces the British and the Hessians to retreat. And this basically kind of changes how both sides view each other. Now the Hessians are viewing the Continental Army as somewhat of a real fighting force. And then the Continental Army is viewing the Hessians a little less superior than they had before. There was a diary of a Continental soldier from January of 1777 that described how, and I quote, "There wasn't a gentleman far and wide who didn't ride into the town to see the Hessians, about whom he had heard such fabulous stories," end quote. So, like, word of the Hessians had really went out across the colonies, and they were quite renowned. And so after this, like, defeat, people are, like, coming to see the people they've heard so much about. And I found this really interesting when doing research for this episode, that Britain had a lot of hesitations about hiring these Hessian soldiers and sending them to the colonies. One of their main fears was desertion, and this is because of the amount of German migrants who lived in the colonies.
Oh, interesting.
So they kind of feared that these soldiers would see, like, I guess their fellow countrymen in a way and leave to live with them. And the Patriots actually tried to use this fear to create a propaganda campaign. They created these pamphlets basically promising land and other incentives to Hessian soldiers who switched sides and, like, joined the Patriot cause. This campaign wasn't actually really successful in, like, doing what it set out to do, but it does show us how the colonial mindset had changed when it comes to the view of these soldiers. So the Hessians made up a really important facet of the British forces in America. And without them, I think it's pretty safe to argue that the war might have ended earlier. And they add another international element to this war.
So, back to the French. They, of course, had their own revolution in the late 1780s and 1790s, and the French Revolution is deeply intertwined with the American Revolution for a multitude of reasons. Can you guys name me one thing you know about the French Revolution?
The storming of the Bastille.
Yes.
The tennis court oath.
Yeah, we obviously won't get into all of the details because this is a podcast about the American Revolution, but it's really important to mention that these two events are really intertwined with each other. So France's involvement in the American Revolution actually left them pretty much bankrupt. And although the French king Louis XVI was an extravagant spender, which sort of contributed to the financial issues as well, they are sort of out of money in a lot of different ways. But us Americans can't be totally blamed due to Louis XVI's spending habits, if you will. France is also just kind of going through a rough time here. Crops are bad, taxes are high, and unrest is running rampant. And it seems like the only people who are thriving in France are the elites. However, as we know, the common men usually outnumber these elites, and numbers are everything, really. Eventually, a rebel group forms known as the Estates General. And the French Revolution is really marked by these watershed moments, like you guys said, the storming of the Bastille, the tennis court oath, and these ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In the end, the French Revolution was successful in overthrowing the absolute monarchy. It abolished feudalism and established a republic in France. But to connect this back to America, the French Revolution was heavily influenced by the American Revolution. The major success of the Americans was fuel to the fire in France, and the thought became, well, if they can do it, so can we. But we Americans did not necessarily return the favor to the French. Reminder, the French have really helped us win our war. But we just fought this really large war for independence, and we were drained, both physically and monetarily. When the French Revolution started, the revolutionaries looked to America for help, but we were sort of divided on whether or not we would help. At this point, two political factions had formed in America in the 1780s and 90s, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and these two could not agree on if the U.S. should involve themselves in the French Revolution. So, what do you guys think? Should we have sort of honored our friendship and joined the fight with the French after all they did to help us win our war?
This is a hard question because I do see both sides of, like, we have just fought this long war. We are depleted in men and money, but also we won this war because of France. So, like, do we owe something to them? Like, maybe I wouldn't say we should have sent, like, an army there, but, like, nothing is a little crazy, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I feel the same way as that. And I also would be curious to see, like, what sort of toll it would have taken on the early United States if we had gotten involved. Like, what would have happened, like, politically, or, like, how would it have changed if we sent a bunch of money or aid? Like, what would that have done to us if we had been more involved?
Yeah, I can see the concerns of the Americans here. We really are low on resources all around. And the division here, I think, is, like you guys said, we want to honor a friendship and, they helped us win our war, so why wouldn't we go help them win theirs? But I do think there's a reasonable hesitation.
This period in history was certainly an age of revolutions, so we need to talk about the Haitian Revolution.
The Haitian Revolution is partially inspired by the American Revolution, but most directly inspired by the French Revolution.
Yeah, so let's jump in and just give some background first. Haiti at this point is known as Saint-Domingue, and it's an official French colony, and it has been since 1697. There is a tropical climate on the island, and it's ideal for sugar plantations.
So I'm guessing if it's based a lot on plantation work, and these sugar plantations, from what I know, that involves a lot of enslaved labor. So I'm guessing there's a pretty large demographic of enslaved people on the island.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The amount of labor needed to run this predominantly sugar plantation society there, because that really is what the society was, it runs off of large amounts of enslaved labor. There's also like a large mixed population on the island, and there's a minority of white planters, and those would be the superiors in the hierarchical chain that they've created on this island. So this is important because at the time of the Haitian Revolution, there's a large population of enslaved people on this island already there, and it can create an ample fighting force. So, starting in 1791 and lasting 13 years, the rebels on Haiti rose up to sort of create their own government, and this was largely it was a slave revolt to begin, and it became an entire revolution. And so it is led by a man named Toussaint Louverture. He was born into slavery and bought his freedom in his 30s. He became well educated in French tradition, and he was especially inspired by the Declaration of Rights of Man, which is created when the French Revolution breaks out.
So the Haitian Revolution took a lot of ideals from other revolutions, like we've talked about, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and they really took this idea of all men are created equal and actually tried to achieve this. So when the enslaved black population on Saint-Domingue revolted in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity, they came closer to kind of this idea of equality for all that all these revolutions talked about than the French or the American Revolution, because this one specifically really tried to do it for all men, including the enslaved. Obviously, this causes some upset around the world, so Americans generally felt quite repulsed by the Haitian Revolution. Do you guys have any thoughts on why?
Well, they also have a enslaved population in the Americas.
Yeah, this would certainly threaten their hold on slavery in the colonies. I mean, the most immediate concern I can think that they would have is word getting to those enslaved within their own southern colonies, and it's sort of inspiring a different kind of revolution in there that would threaten them, like their lives, but also their economy more generally.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We talked about last episode how the British themselves tried to use fear of a slave revolt against the colonies, and that fear still largely exists during this time. So white people that are escaping Saint-Domingue start arriving in American ports and tell their stories, and Americans really begin to fear this idea and the implications of the Haitian Revolution. Because when Americans said that all men are created equal, they're not counting the enslaved in their mind. So Haiti wanted two things out of this revolution. They want to overthrow French colonial rule and end slavery on the island. So in 1804, they finally achieved their independence. Toussaint Louverture, as you had mentioned, sadly didn't see this victory. He died in a French prison a year earlier in 1803. The Haitian Revolution really picked up what was born in the 13 colonies, but it radicalized the age of revolutions, and it took a step farther into emancipation and liberty for Black individuals. I feel like when we talk about the age of revolutions, we always hear about the American Revolution, we hear about the French Revolution, but often we don't hear about the Haitian Revolution. And I think it's one that's really important, and I was wondering why you guys think we don't hear about it when we talk about these other ones.
I honestly think that, maybe not by like professional historians, but I think by the general public, or those who are well-versed in the Haitian Revolution, they wrongly equate it to a slave revolt. Mm-hmm. And, like, perhaps that is an element of it. Like you said, half of what they were trying to do is end slavery on the island to create this equality. But I feel like that in of itself is revolution. They're creating something entirely different. And also beyond that, they're overthrowing the colonial rule in their society. And like I think that people see the like maybe the race aspect of what went on in the Haitian Revolution and equate it to a slave revolt rather than a legitimate revolution.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really fair point.
I also just want to say, I think it's incredibly ironic as the Founding Fathers are fighting their own revolution and claiming that they are enslaved by Great Britain, that they would not also, in turn, see their own hypocrisy and continuing the cycle that they say is so oppressive to them.
Yeah, and it's even interesting to see that the French have just fought their revolution and are now fighting against a revolution in Haiti. It's a lot of irony all around.
Yeah.
So jumping back to the American Revolution, the fighting ended in 1781 with Yorktown, but it would not be that simple to end the war entirely.
Agreeing on ending the war was laborious, to be blunt.
Each side was heavily hardlining for their best interest, and with several powers involved, there was a lot to be negotiated. There's actually 4 treaties that are drawn in total to end this conflict. The first is between the United States and Great Britain, the second is between France and Great Britain, the third is between Spain and Great Britain, and the fourth is between Great Britain and the Netherlands.
So, let's look at what the U.S. wants for a second. They obviously want to be recognized as a sovereign nation. They fought this whole war really for this purpose, and this is something that they're not willing to give up on, which I think makes sense. They also will not sign a treaty without approval from France. As we talked about, France had been an important ally, and they aren't willing to sign a treaty without France feeling that it fits their needs as well. A little ironic when we think about how we don't help them in their revolution later on, but I digress. They also want clear and favorable boundaries and territorial claims on North America. They feel that they have fought this war and that they deserve access to the land closest to them, not these imperial powers in Europe. So obviously they get recognized as this sovereign nation, and they do get land east of the Mississippi River, but they do not get Canada, which they had wanted at one point. And if you know anything about American history, we later go back and try to get Canada. And this deal is obviously not great for Native Americans. They previously had this buffer against colonial settlement, but now the Americans kind of get the green light to go ahead and move in. This is really an encroachment on Native American land.
So moving over to look at what Spain is trying to get, their main focus is their own American colonies. This is really where their wealth lies. So with their colonies in mind, what do you think they worry about most with the Americans?
I'm sure they don't want the Americans to keep moving, I guess, westward in North America.
That's certainly important to them, but it's actually a little bit more specific. So it's the Mississippi River. They want to retain control of the Mississippi River and access to it. They don't want the U.S. to encroach really far out, but to encroach on the river. So they didn't like an emerging American empire, like I said before, so close to their colonies. The Mississippi River was a good buffer, but also good for moving goods down to the port at New Orleans. So to sort of assert control over this, they closed the port of New Orleans to American navigation in 1784, and these problems of the waterway of the Mississippi River to New Orleans would persist. Also, they're holding out for Gibraltar, something we keep bringing up. Their concerns and efforts for Gibraltar affect the British. And how do you think this impacted the treaties?
Well, we kind of talked about how America won't sign without France. And if I'm correct, I believe France won't sign without Spain. So if Spain isn't getting what they want, is anybody really signing anything?
Yeah, you're correct. So Spain and France have been allies even before France and America signed a treaty with each other. And so France is not willing to sign without Spain's agreement. And the British are holding out on returning Gibraltar, so Spain doesn't want to sign. And this actually leads to everyone signing their own treaties rather than just signing one. So like I listed, there was actually 4 treaties. This issue is why. And just in case you were curious, Gibraltar is not returned, and I believe it still belongs to Great Britain today.
Okay, and lastly, the British. I guess this section is more about what they lost rather than what they gained. But I do want to sort of pose this conceptual question. From the British perspective, I'm sort of wondering if they saw the American win as, wow, our empire is sort of crumbling, or whatever, it's just 13 colonies. And maybe a mix of these two ideas?
I guess it might have been, like, high school history class where I, like, heard this, and I'm not sure the exact merits of it, but I believe part of why the war started to end is because those in Great Britain got so disinterested and just like, why are we funneling money and troops and effort into a war about things that people were starting to care less and less about. So I'm sure that it was definitely, you lost out economically majorly, but at least for maybe the population of Great Britain, I think there was starting to be this like disinterest maybe.
I think that's a great point, and I think it's also important to remember that, like, Great Britain has a lot of other colonies at the time. They have the West Indies, who are, like, sugar plantations, so, like, they aren't losing the entirety of their empire, but, like, definitely an important part, so I do imagine it's kind of a mix of these sentiments.
Also, something else to note is they had no idea what the American experiment would become.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way at this point in history to tell that the Americans would sort of become an empire in their own sense.
Yeah, also piggybacking off of what Macy said about the British West Indies specifically, the American colonies are not even their most lucrative colonies. Like, this isn't losing, I mean, it's losing some, but it's not even losing your primary mode of, like, wealth. Like, the West Indies dwarf the American colonies.
So back to what these treaties sort of mean for them. Great Britain has to recognize the U.S. as a sovereign country. The U.S. gets to enter this community of sovereign states. And democracy, liberty, and these other ideals prevail because the war is won and the democratic experiment can begin. This is all sort of what we talked about. Great Britain could sort of never know at this point in time that this would become the American experiment, but it does. Great Britain does get one thing, like Bridget mentioned, and that is Gibraltar. So it's not all lost for the British in these treaties.
For something that seems to be so important and so recurring, I have not heard about Gibraltar really up to this point.
I was thinking that the entire episode.
I couldn't even tell you like where it is on a map.
It's on Morocco, right?
Yeah,
Or
it's like it's kind of like
Yeah.
Isn't it like connected to Spain almost? Or it's like it's
like,
somewhere in that
on
region.
That entrance from the Atlantic.
Yeah, I
to
think
the
that's why it's
Mediterranean.
important. It's like
That would make sense.
Control the like strait.
Like, I just really had not known just the pivotal role it plays in the American Revolution.
It's also really interesting that it's still a part of Great Britain today.
Yeah.
The American Revolution didn't just create a new nation. It sparked a wave of change that rippled across the globe.
From France to Haiti, the fight for liberty took on new meanings, shaped by different people with different goals.
What began as a colonial rebellion became an international turning point, redefining power, empire, and freedom.
As Ben Franklin said, this cause became something bigger than America alone.